The DRC, the Congo, which is bleeding to this day, right? The geopolitical tension for the resources of the DRC during the Cold War, millions of people killed for decades. That is, whose interest is it serving? It's the competition of the major powers trying to reproduce the colonial model that we described today, to extract from the DRC, not to allow the DRC to have its own sovereignty and independence and potential to be the richest, one of the most powerful nations on the planet. That is not allowed, right? So these are lessons for us from history to understand that nobody's going to come to fix the system for you on your own terms, for your own benefits. They will do it for themselves. They may be helpful, but you have to develop your own vision and create your own leverage in order to get things done on your own terms. That is really the message that I get from history, from what we're seeing. And that's why this, the geopolitical transformation, the decolonization is not going to happen because of BRICS. It's not going to happen because of G7. It's not even going to happen because of China or Russia or any other country. It can only be born, and it can only happen with the formation of global South leadership on its own terms, and then using the existing geopolitical competitive space to give and take, and to try to to reposition itself in a more favorable in the global economy. And it's not going to be easy, but it's not going to be done by anybody else.
You're listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.
We think that ideology is something blurring, confusing our straight view. Ideology should be glasses which distort our view. And the critique of ideology should be the opposite. Like, you take off the glasses so that you can finally see the way things really are.
When you talk about a revolution, most people think violence, without realizing that the real content of any kind of revolutionary thrust lies in the principles and the goals that you're striving for, not in the way you reach them.
Philosophers call someone a relativist, by which they mean it's a person that holds that any view is as good as any other view. My simple response to that is this: no one holds that view. No one believes that every view is as good as every other view.
Welcome to One Dime Radio. Today I'm here with Fadhel Kaboub, a professor of economics who specializes in modern monetary theory, MMT. And this is a topic that listeners have been waiting for, particularly because when it comes to the coverage that I've done so far on MMT, on the main videos on the channel One Dime, as well as the podcast interviews with various thinkers, from Bill Mitchell to Warren Bosler to Phil Armstrong back in the day, people have asked, well, what about the global South? And this is, of course, something that MMT theorists deal with, but at the level of theory, but at the level of practice, this is something that you specialize in. This is your whole thing, is, trying to get countries in the global South to become monetarily sovereign, to have a monetary sovereignty. Now, the first question I want to ask you with, along with any other details you would like to introduce yourself with that I missed, you're, of course, a leading advocate of MMT and specializing in these regions that people often think MMT doesn't apply to, or don't try to think about how it could be applied there. I mean, how did you come across MMT and what we could call maybe heterodox economics more broadly? What was the pill for you? When did you get pilled by MMT?
Sure.
So to speak?
When did I catch the bug? Well, first of all, thank you so much for the kind invitation and for hosting this conversation. So I went to grad school at the University of Missouri in Kansas City, which is where a lot of the MMT scholars were teaching at a time. Workshops and conferences and summer programs were hosted by the economics department at UMKC at the time. So this is where Randy Ray used to teach before he retired. Stephanie Kelton was there. A lot of the post-Keynesians who were interested in monetary theory and monetary policy issues were hosted there. Of course, Matthew Forstater, among others, were my teachers. And at the time, a lot of the focus in the early days of what became known as MMT, modern monetary theory, a lot of the focus was on the US economy, just by nature, because most of the economists who were interested in those questions were in the US, and to some extent Australia with Bill Mitchell. So naturally, a lot of the scholarship that was published was focused on developed countries. But the graduate students, a lot of us were from the global south. So we were very interested in how these ideas would be applied, would translate, what would be the nuances. So that motivated a lot of the research that graduate students at the time either did for their dissertation or after they graduated. And that was basically my case. I was interested in how these ideas would apply in the context of developing countries that have very different challenges and very different constraints and very different histories. We were talking about former colonies. So that's really how I caught the bug, and that became sort of my my area of focus and interest, including the idea of the job guarantee, but including the idea of monetary sovereignty. And unfortunately, a lot of people tend to think of monetary sovereignty as you either have it or you don't, as a binary sort of thing. But in reality, when we talk about monetary sovereignty, it's a spectrum. It's the idea of, each country having a certain degree of monetary sovereignty. Some countries have a very high degree of monetary sovereignty. That'll be a country like the US, for example. And other countries have very limited degree of monetary sovereignty, or some countries have no monetary sovereignty whatsoever because they've just lost that monetary sovereignty or never had it to begin with, or for some reason decided to give it up. So the example of Ecuador, for example, a country that dollarized its economy, just gave up the national currency altogether. That's not a country that has monetary sovereignty. The example of African countries, former French colonies that to this day continue to use the CFA franc, which is a colonial currency. Those are countries that don't have monetary sovereignty. So as a result, not all countries have the same degree of economic sovereignty. And as a result, not all countries have the same fiscal policy space that they can use to invest in national priorities. So that's really what sort of motivates my research now, is how do you get countries in the global south who have very limited degree of monetary sovereignty to actually invest strategically to increase the degree of monetary sovereignty. So that's the starting point. And then we can talk about, well, what determines, how high the degree of monetary sovereignty for a country, and what are these strategic investments that will allow you to acquire a higher degree of monetary sovereignty? Because it's not something that you acquire by decree. It's not like the president or prime minister saying, today we're going to have, a high degree of monetary sovereignty. It's not a political statement. It's something that you acquire with hard work, with strategic investments in key areas, so you can actually start to enjoy the benefits of true economic sovereignty.
So out the gate, there's a couple of things I think we should unpack in order for the listener to understand the conversation. Well, one is MMT itself, because I assume sometimes that people who've been following this show for a while have a base idea of what it is, but it's always worth repeating when it comes to these things, because even some people think they know, don't, and it's a very diverse field, right? So there's 3 questions related to what you just said that I think you could kind of all answer at once, because they're all related, which is, 1, what is MMT? 2, what is monetary sovereignty? Like, what does it mean? What does it mean to have monetary sovereignty? I know it's on a spectrum. It's not a thing you have or have not, but like, what does that really mean in tangible terms? And the third part, which is part of the same set of questions really, is, some people think MMT is just something that is relevant to America. And so why is that view incorrect? So I guess you'd start with the first and then make way to the end.
So MMT at a fundamental level is describing what countries that have monetary sovereignty can or cannot do when it comes to national priorities. So maybe it's helpful to start explaining what does a country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty. So if you have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, it means you can issue your national currency, and that is something that most countries around the world can do. Number two, it's a country that collects taxes and fees in that same national currency. And that's something, again, that most countries can do, including in the global south. But this is where things start to get different between advanced, countries with a high degree of monetary sovereignty and developing countries that don't have that high degree of monetary sovereignty. Number three is when a country is not compelled to issue debt denominated in a foreign currency. So think of the United States, for example. The entire national debt stock is issued and is denominated in US dollars. The entire Japanese national debt, which is one of the countries with the largest debt to GDP ratios in the world, in the history of the world, actually. Japan's debt stock is denominated in Japanese yen. So those are countries that have high degree of monetary sovereignty, whereas developing countries, most of government debt is denominated in foreign currencies, and that weakens the degree of monetary sovereignty. And then number four, finally, which is related to number three, is the fact that when you have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, you're not compelled to fix your exchange rate to the US dollar or to the euro or to any foreign currency. And this is something that you see in the United States, for example. The US is not obligated or compelled to stabilize its exchange rate against any other currency. And it's not because it's the reserve currency of the world or whatever. There are other reasons. Other countries who are not reserve currency countries also are not compelled by economic pressures to stabilize their exchange rate, whereas developing countries are almost systematically compelled to do that, which limits the degree of monetary sovereignty and the degree of economic sovereignty, and kind of rewires your entire economic priorities to prioritize economic activity that is extractive, that is actually reproducing colonial structural traps. So to me, MMT is like the lens that allows you to identify which countries have that high degree of monetary sovereignty and therefore economic sovereignty, and therefore a larger fiscal policy space to invest in national priorities, and which countries are constrained structurally and are forced to basically throw their own people under the bus in the process of trying to reproduce structural economic traps that they're unable to undo unless you identify the strategic areas that will allow you to acquire a higher degree of economic and monetary sovereignty. So the big misunderstanding that a lot of observers who are not, didn't bother really to look at the details of the MMT theory, saying, okay, so you're saying these countries that have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, they can just print money and spend left and right on all the priorities and have, big wars and big deficit spending without any consequences. They say this is ridiculous, it's going to cause hyperinflation. And that is not what the MMT has ever said. If anything, MMT economists are actually obsessed with the risk of inflation. When the critics say, oh, MMTers don't care about inflation. If anything, MMT says countries with any degree of monetary sovereignty, before they deficit spend, what they need to do is identify the inflation pressure points that they have in their economy. And the inflation pressure points, or the risk of inflation, is always determined by two key factors. Number one, it's the availability of real resources in terms of physical resources, productive capacity, skills, labor skills and the labor force, logistics, supply chain disruptions related to that particular sector. Those are the real constraints, because when you deficit spend and increase demand in those areas, if your productive capacity, logistical capacity, labor capacity is unable to keep up with the additional demand, then you will face inflation pressure in that particular sector. But the good news about productive capacity and logistics and all of that is that productive capacity is producible. So you can invest strategically to increase the productive capacity. And that gives you a larger deficit spending capacity, a larger fiscal policy space. So that's half the story. That's the inflation risk that is determined by productive capacity type of things. The second thing that determines the risk of inflation is what I call abusive market power and price setting behavior. That is, if you have key players in your economy, domestically or internationally, that can raise prices simply because they can, then of course you're going to have inflation pressure points that will constrain your deficit spending capacity. And that kind of inflation risk is not going to be eliminated by austerity. It's not going to be eliminated by not spending. The only way to eliminate it is by taxing and regulating that abusive market power out of existence. In other words, you democratize your economy, right? Antitrust laws and taxation that is directed not at raising revenues, but at dismantling that abusive market power. So if you carefully assess the risk of inflation in each one of the pressure points that you have, inflation pressure points that you have in your economy, and target those inflation pressure points with strategic spending and taxation that builds additional productive capacity and democratizes the market structure that you have, then you've successfully increased your fiscal policy space and you've successfully increased the degree of your economic and monetary sovereignty. And those strategic decisions are made by whom? They're made by your parliament, your Congress, your political authority. So fundamentally, this is a question about, do we have a government of the people, by the people, for the people, or a government for the corporation, by the corporations, by the super PACs, and for the super PAC? Because you're targeting abusive market power and you're trying to democratize economic structures. And that's fundamentally a core component of a democratic society. So that is the MMT lens and the paradigm shift that we're proposing here. And then you can use what I just described here in terms of this sort of obsession with the risk of inflation and targeting the inflation pressure points. You can use that in developed countries like the US and developing countries in the global South. Fundamentally, it's the same analytical approach. It's the same lens that you use, but then the pressure points and the explanation for why certain sectors experience deficiencies or experience abusive market power, those are very different, for example, between the US and other developing countries. So that's the starting point for understanding MMT as far as I'm concerned.
So to recap, the basic idea is a country that has its own currency and spends in its own currency, issues most of its debt or bonds in its own currency, collects taxes on that currency, can create its own money with the only barriers to that being inflation. And those barriers depend on its productive capacity, not just like the currency itself, whether you're going to run out of it or whether there's too much or too little. It's the productive constraints. And that's why you emphasize that the limits are resource constraints rather than financial constraints. Now,
Absolutely.
Some people will make the argument that because the US dollar is worth so much, because it's the reserve currency, it can get away with spending more. And some will point to maybe, let's say, the British pound or the euro. They're more valuable. Because they're more valuable, they have more, I guess you could say, ability to create lots of money without inflationary consequences, unlike a country with a less valuable currency. Now, I just want to address this argument because this kind of misconception seems to be the most popular instinctual reaction, which is like this idea that the value of the currency and whether people use it is inherently what determines a country's, whether any of what MMT says is applicable. And I kind of asked this before, but I mean, I really want you to address this particular thing regarding like the value of the currency, because people have this idea in their head that if you spend more, the value of the currency just drops. and that if you have a more valuable currency, you can spend more. It's kind of like the very like common sense way a lot of people picture things.
Yeah, it's not correct. I mean, you start to really understand this when you look at developing countries that follow austerity policies and try to balance budgets and actually have budget surpluses in some cases, but still have a weak currency. So here's how to think of this in terms of developing countries when it comes to the exchange rate, the value of the currency. The fundamental structural deficiencies that countries in the global south have can be summarized in three basic deficiencies. And their sort of visual representation is usually the external debt problem, which limits your fiscal policy space because countries have to dedicate so much of their export revenues, for example, to service the debt, external debt. But external debt is a symptom of these deeper structural issues, which can be summarized in 3 points. Number one, energy deficits. Number two, food deficits. And number three, value-added manufacturing deficits. And as you know, no economy can thrive without food, without energy, and without some kind of industrial activity. And these are the core deficiencies that we have in the global south. And when I say food deficits in Africa, for example, according to UNCTAD, Africa today imports 85% of its food, when less than 100 years ago, it used to be the breadbasket for colonial powers. And that was not by accident. That transformation was a post-colonial transformation that was very quickly introduced in the mid-1950s, early 1960s, when European countries, for example, realized that they are now looking at independent countries in Africa who are the big producers of their food. So Europe discovered that it has a food insecurity problem. So Europe introduced the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, which is in place to this day. It's a basic pillar of the European Union to this day. CAP is essentially a heavy agricultural subsidies system to prioritize the production of core crops in Europe, corn, wheat, barley, soybean, and so on. And when you introduce these heavy agricultural subsidies to restore food sovereignty in Europe, you're now producing a massive surplus of these core crops and dumping it in the global south in markets where farmers are not subsidized by their own governments. So they couldn't compete with the cheaper imported wheat and corn, for example, coming from Europe, but also coming from the former Soviet Union, which is why Russia and Ukraine to this day dominate the grain industry, because other major economic blocs started doing the same, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, and so on. So the major blocs started subsidizing their agriculture to restore or strengthen their food sovereignty, and they destroyed food sovereignty in the global south. And they forced global south farmers to give up the production of those core crops and specialize in complementary food items or agricultural items. So we produce coffee, tea, tobacco, rubber, tropical fruits and lots of tomatoes and watermelon and things like that, which are, heavy consumers of water in terms of crops. But as soon as you start to specialize in cash crops for exports, like these commodities that I described, then you are now compelled to plant and harvest commodities that your consumers in the global north want to consume. So you start using non-native crops. So non-native seeds that are not acclimated to your soil, to your environment. They require irrigation. So you have to build the logistical infrastructure for irrigation, the logistical infrastructure and refrigeration for exports. You have to use precious water resources that you don't have all the time. And you have to use fertilizers that you must import and pesticides that you must import. So that locks you into a structural deficiency, which is why Africa today imports most of its food, for example. And when you do that, by the way, for several decades, you burn the fertility of your soil with fertilizers and pesticides and all of that and industrial scale agriculture. And that means you always have to double down by bringing in more potent seeds, more potent fertilizers, more potent, herbicides and so on. And that just destroys your agricultural base. And that is, by the way, called food security, right? Food security, I always say, is the most dangerous post-colonial concept that was introduced in the global south, because it literally means you secure the caloric nutrition of your people by exporting those cash crops to earn dollars to import your core crops from the global north. Or you produce it domestically, which we don't do anymore. So you end up importing a lot of your food, and you end up borrowing money to import your food, which sets you up in a debt trap. Or even worse, you receive it as food aid. Food aid is the worst thing you can do to your farmers because they can't compete with free corn or wheat coming from USAID or any of the international development aid programs. So that is food security, and it's a colonial trap, and that's why we always talk about trying to restore food sovereignty using native seeds and native crops and permaculture essentially as an approach to sustainable agriculture, not just in the global south and in the global north, because we now know that the health and environmental consequences of the kind of industrial agriculture that we've introduced over the decades. And that's the first structural deficiency. That's the food deficit. And no country can function without food. The second structural deficiency is energy deficits. And here I'll talk about the old energy system that we're trying to get rid of, the fossil fuel system. When I say energy deficits in Africa, for example, I'm not talking about countries that have no fossil fuels. I'm talking about the biggest oil exporters on the continent. Nigeria, up until a few months ago, imported 100% of its gasoline from international markets, gasoline that is actually illegal to sell in Europe, for example. Angola, the second largest exporter of oil on the continent, imports 80% of its fuel from international markets. And these are the big producers, of course. But the challenge here is that we've always been denied access to the technology to look for oil, to drill for oil, and to refine oil. So when you look at the big, oil and gas agreements with the big multinationals from the global north, they almost never give you the capacity to refine enough fuel for your domestic economy. They always want you to export the crude and import the more expensive gasoline and kerosene and petrochemicals. So you're locked into a debt trap. And that is the old energy system of the past. The new energy system, where Africa, for example, has the biggest potential on the planet, we're systematically denied access to the technology to manufacture and deploy the renewables with the critical minerals that we have, actually, and denied access to financing to unleash that potential. And we can come back to this point later. So that's the energy deficit component. That's a major source of external debt for most countries. And then finally, the kind of manufacturing base that we were allowed to have in the global south, and I use my words carefully, allowed to have, is the kind where you have to import the machines, you have to import the fuel to power the factories, you have to import the intermediate components to be assembled with low-cost labor, and we even import the packaging. So you end up with a manufacturing base that exports low value-added content and imports high value-added content. So you can double, triple, quadruple your exports with, free trade agreements and partnerships and all of that, but you're essentially permanently locked at the bottom of the global value chain, at the bottom of the hierarchy. And now this is where the exchange rate comes in. You have these three major structural deficits: food, energy, and manufacturing, which means you have a structural trade deficit year after year, decade after decade. And as you know, any country with a structural trade deficit, its currency becomes weaker relative to the dollar, relative to the euro over time. And with the weaker national currency, in terms of exchange rate, anything I need to import the next morning, food, fuel, medicine, I have to import it now at a higher price because I have a weaker currency. So I literally import inflation in the most sensitive areas of my economy for my society: food, fuel, medicine, and so on. So that then immediately forces governments in the global south to intervene to protect the most vulnerable people, because food prices and fuel prices are high and so on. So what do governments do? They do two things. Number one, they subsidize food, fuel, medicine as much as possible. And it's unsustainable to do this for decades. And number two, they ask their central banks to do their best to defend the exchange rate. How does the central bank fix the exchange rate, defend the exchange rate? The Band-Aid solution is to borrow more dollars, more euros, more British pounds. And that continues to fuel the external debt crisis. And now that you have debt denominated in foreign currencies, your lenders will demand that you pay them back on time in dollars or in euros, which means now you have to rearrange all of your economic priorities, not to invest in health or education or infrastructure that you actually need for your development, but you start prioritizing economic activity that will generate dollars as quickly as possible. So here comes the extractive industry saying, we want to mine your mountains. We want to extract your oil and your gas, and here's some dollars to service your debt, right? And we want to use your low-cost labor, but you really have to give us a tax break, and you give us the land for free and the water for free, and we're not paying retirement benefits for your workers, by the way. And you have to give us cheaper electricity and cheaper access to water so that we can come in with foreign direct investment, employ 1,000 workers to assemble stuff for us, and we'll give you some dollars for that. So you end up, completely rewiring your economic priorities to reproduce the colonial structural traps, the colonial economic role that was imposed for centuries, which is three things. You're supposed to be the place for cheap raw materials for the industrialized world. We still play that role to this day. You're supposed to be the consumers of industrial output and technologies from the global north. We still play that role to this day. And number three, and most importantly, you're supposed to be the place where obsolete technologies, assembly line manufacturing that is no longer needed in the industrialized world is outsourced to you under the label of development cooperation. And it's effectively to lock you at the bottom of the hierarchy, the bottom of the value chain. So these structural economic deficiencies that persist to this day, they actually reproduce the economic role that was imposed on the colonies centuries ago, and it persists to this day. So that's what limits the degree of monetary sovereignty, because the limiting of the degree of monetary sovereignty is directly linked to the fact that these are colonial economic systems that are not supposed to have any sovereignty. They're supposed to be the source of extraction for the former colonial powers. And that is fundamentally what needs to be understood. And this is where the MMT lens helps us clarify where these structural deficiencies come from. And now we can talk about how the MMT lens can clarify how the structural transformation can happen and how countries can actually make strategic choices to their economic and monetary sovereignty over time. We're not saying it's easy, but at least now we know what needs to be done in a very precise way, in very precise sectors. And now we can strategize in terms of how do we actually marshal the resources and build sort of the economic and geopolitical leverage, because this is about power. This is about a colonial hierarchy that is not meant to be disrupted. How do we leverage the geopolitical power to disrupt the system?
And we'll touch on that and we'll get right there. I first want to address, because it's very relevant to what you were just saying about food sovereignty. And it's also something that people instantly think whenever they hear MMT. That is, what about Venezuela? Venezuela is the famous example. And you mentioned this being the colonial trap, the economy of kind of following really the Ricardian model of comparative advantage, this idea that, just stick to what you're good at. And, double down on that. But like Venezuela, right, kind of, correct me if I'm wrong, wasn't their problem that they basically just continued oil production? It's like they were just a petrol state, except with nationalized oil this time under Chavez, and it worked well while it lasted, in the sense that they got all this foreign currency from all this petrol sales that he would use to import food from abroad. To go basically have like cheap, affordable food for the poorest. And that's why you had huge reductions of poverty. But then when the price of oil dropped, you had basically inflation, because now it's cost way more to get all that food. So isn't that like a really good proof of kind of what you're saying, like MMT? So does Venezuela, is what I'm saying, does Venezuela kind of prove MMT correct?
In terms of the analysis that I just described here, right? But a lot of people, look at Venezuela and say, oh, look, progressive government spent so much money, caused hyperinflation. And they forget that, structurally the Venezuelan economy, even under Chavez, at the peak of his success, quote unquote, in terms of economic and social progress, it was still structurally a colonial economy that is 90% dependent on oil revenues. And as soon as the sanctions were introduced to shut down the oil industry, because people forget that the initial sanctions were not even to ban exports of oil. The initial sanctions was restricting access to spare parts for the oil industry. And when your pumps break and you have no spare parts, then your entire, oil industry is shut down, essentially. In addition to other issues, of course, that happened related to, the political system and social movements that were manipulated during that period. But essentially, you shut down the entire economic system that has no resilience, that has no food sovereignty, no energy sovereignty. You have all this oil, but you can't pump it, you can't refine it, so you can't use it as a source of energy, and that fundamentally cripples your entire economic system.
And also, what about Zimbabwe? Because that's another global South country that is pointed to as an example. Hyperinflation, right?
All right. So Zimbabwe is the following situation. So you have, a former colony with a president that decided to redistribute land away from the white minority, former colonial settlers to the Black majority population. So we can have a debate about land redistribution and all of that and what it means. But I'll focus on the technical aspect that led to the hyperinflation. Let's not get into, was it right? Was it wrong? Was it good? Was it bad? That's a separate discussion. But now you're distributing land from, certain farmers that used to produce a certain amount of food for your domestic economy to individuals who are politically connected to the center of power. Many of them are soldiers or generals or, families of, privileged individuals who are actually not interested in farming, and they're not actually farmers. So what happened immediately with that redistribution is that production of food dropped by 50%. So now your economy is 50% deficient in terms of food production. In any country where you have food production dropping by 50%, but demand is still the same, naturally the price is going to jump up. And that is disruptive. And you're creating food shortages. So now you have higher food prices. People are very unhappy about it, naturally. And that means you're now panicking as a government. So what do you do? So one of the first things that the government did, instead of producing more food or figuring out how to stabilize the price of food or how to sign an agreement with a neighboring country to, step in and complement the food production on favorable terms or reasonable terms, none of that was done. Instead, immediately the government paid security forces, police and military, higher salaries so that they can afford the food, because you need the security system not to turn against you. So now you're giving a bunch of people extra cash to go into the same market to outbid everybody else for the scarce food that is available. So that immediately starts to increase food prices even more. And anywhere in the world, this is not in Zimbabwe, even in my own country, in Tunisia and other places, anywhere where people notice that food is significantly more expensive in this country than right across the border in South Africa, for example. So that immediately sets up entrepreneurship, on steroids, essentially. So you have a bunch of people getting on a truck and crossing the border and buying the cheaper food from South Africa or any other neighboring country. It doesn't have to be Zimbabwe or South Africa. And loading that truck with food items that they know that they can sell immediately and coming back to sell them at a premium. And of course, when you do that, you're going to have to cross borders, which means you're going to have to, somehow bribe border patrols, and you have to, bribe, every other checkpoint, in South Africa and in Zimbabwe, which means when you develop a large network of now, trade that is designed to address the food shortage situation and take advantage of the price differential, all of a sudden you have a small army of people crossing the borders to do this. and they're all bribing everybody across the system. So everybody is in the system now to take advantage of this hyperinflation moment. So no hyperinflation in that particular case is going to end unless you actually reintroduce your domestic food sovereignty, or you figure out a way to increase domestic food production, and you cripple that cross-border trafficking and corruption that became rampant across the entire security system. And that was initially Zimbabwe's problem. And of course, the more prices escalate, it forces your country, your government, to actually issue more currency to meet the demand for more dollars, more Zimbabwe dollars. And that continues to accelerate. So it's not the government printing money that caused inflation. Inflation was caused by a disruption in the real productive capacity, a disruption in the logistics and availability of real resources, which is exactly what MMT has always said. And you don't have to take my word for it. The American Enterprise Institute, which is not your MMT, think tank, did a study many years ago now, maybe about 10 years ago, on all the cases where we've seen hyperinflation around the world. And they concluded that in every case, it was a disruption of the production capacity, either by war or conflict or corruption or some kind of case. It's always the case. It's almost never the case of the government going crazy with printing money left and right and causing hyperinflation. So if anything, the Zimbabwe case confirms the analytical validity of MMT when it comes to inflation or hyperinflation. And to be honest with you, I was at some point, there was, some political parties in Zimbabwe that were kind of trying to come up with a different economic set of solutions to the hyperinflation problem. This is a few years after, and I'm not going to name which political parties, but we had several conversations. At the time, it was before Zoom. It was on conference calls. And I provided this explanation ultimately. And as I was speaking, sort of the line on the other hand went quiet. And I thought maybe the line dropped and it was like, hello. And then after a couple of seconds, somebody answered from the other side and said, they will kill us if we try to do what you just said, which is try to increase productive capacity, tackle corruption, cross-border trafficking, because they realized it became so out of control in terms of now a very powerful, criminal entity, essentially sucking the lifeblood out of the country because it works for them, right? For that small group of people who are now manipulating the cross-border trafficking that was sparked by this hyperinflation. And that is fundamentally what needs to happen. I remember earlier we talked about democratizing your economic system, right? Going after the price setters, the abusive price setters. That is essentially the case in Zimbabwe and many other cases where you see hyperinflation. And this cross-border trafficking, by the way, happens in many parts of the world. And when people traffic food and medicine or gasoline or fuel, they'll traffic anything. Right? They'll traffic weapons, they'll traffic terrorists. So it becomes a very difficult system to undo, from a political, economic, and security standpoint. But it needs to be addressed.
This also tracks with a non-MMT book, but it's kind of more mainstream book, but it's pretty famous, The Why Nations Fail, Origins of Power and Prosperity. One thing that they are very big on is institutions that are, competent and can create a functioning marketplace, literally good government, basically. And I think that is the thing you mentioned about, cartels playing such a kind of disruptive role in this, and these monopolistic price setters and agents of disorder really in the economy. I mean, this is also kind of case for why there is a leftist case for tough on crime. like in places where it actually matters, right? Where it affects regular people. Just want to say that to all my libertarian friends out there who,
No, but it's not the same kind of connotation of being tough on crime. I mean,
not
as I
petty
said in the
criminals. These are
beginning,
like
you
real
cannot
criminals.
blame,
Yeah.
you cannot blame people who live, near the border for trying to figure out a way to make a living. So that's not the criminal part. And then once they attempt to do that, they're going to have to cross border and they're going to have to face off with border agents who are also poor people in the system. And there are structural issues that create that corruption opportunity. And of course, a lot of it ends up being like real crime, right? Because trafficking is not just food and fuel and medicine. It's trafficking drugs, it's trafficking weapons, it's
Right.
trafficking. Then it becomes out of control, right? But I wouldn't start by blaming the first guy who decided to cross the border to bring milk from South Africa
Right.
for his kid and for the neighborhood,
Well,
right?
so how does a country fix this if this is such a huge barrier to, monetary sovereignty? How does a country go about creating the conditions that would prevent such disruptions that would lead to like huge inflationary pressure?
Yeah, you disrupt the disruption with disruption. So you disrupt the system by overwhelming the market with new additional productive capacity that you must protect. You protect it because if you are going to introduce new productive capacity that will now compete with the traffickers, they will not let you do it. They will fight you to death.
Yeah, like just
Which means
that's
you have
why
to
I thought
protect-
about that when you just said, "Oh, they'll
Yeah,
less."
so you have to protect you have to be very careful. You have to work on all fronts. You work on the security front, on the productive capacity front, on the, popular education front, buy, certain products that are labeled domestic, kind of buy local type of thing. And it's not easy. Nobody's saying easy, but that's the only way to restore stability to your currency, to your system. It's not going to be, stability of the value of the currency and fighting hyperinflation is not going to be done by the central bank doing what Zimbabwe's central bank has done a few times by issuing a new currency or issuing a new denomination or saying you have to use the national currency instead of dollars. None of that fixes the problem of lack of food in the system, lack of fuel, right? The structural deficiencies is what you have to go after.
This is a question I was debating asking kind of as like an extra thing after, just because it's not as crucial, but it's directly relevant now to what you're saying, and this really makes me think about it. I know your specializations is in primarily Africa, but what do you think of the El Salvadorian president? Some people have speculated whether he's MMT pilled, quote unquote, because he's recently done speeches saying how taxes don't actually fund government spending and saying all sort of stuff. MMTers have been saying that like most leaders don't know, or at least don't admit that they know. And he's, of course, gone after the cartels pretty hard after the cartels. Some have critiqued maybe some of the excesses of that. But yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, he's not the, sort of unique in that regard. We're talking about political leaders who are progressive and have sort of the right kind of rhetoric about what needs to be done, but have no technical capacity or understanding of how things actually work and what needs to be done. So he heard this idea about MMT and that, picked up a few lines and made a speech about it and sort of got people excited. But also at the same time, he decided to go crypto.
That's right.
Right. And never addressed the structural issues that I described in his own country, in El Salvador, in terms of actual economic sovereignty. And from what I gather a few weeks ago or a couple of weeks ago, they decided to declare that the crypto experiment is a failure. Now they have to give it up. So it's not unique to El Salvador. You see this with a lot of progressive leaders in the global South, sort of a confused approach to economic policy. And it's because, I don't expect presidents and political leaders to understand all the technical details. Where are the economic advisors? Where are the people in the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Economic Planning who understand what needs to be done to match the progressive rhetoric and the progressive aspirations of their constituents? They're not there because they're trained in mainstream economics. They cycle through IMF and World Bank training programs, and they create this lack of capacity, bureaucratic capacity, administrative capacity to actually implement and govern in a way that restores economic and monetary sovereignty. That's where you see the mismatch between the rhetoric of progressive leaders in the South and the actual action.
If a country doesn't have much productive capacity, it doesn't have most importantly, the sovereignty, that monetary sovereignty, how does a country, that is still developing go about that process, given that it's already more constrained financially? So if it needs to spend to, like, for example, build up its food supply, create jobs, and it already has constraints, how does it go about doing that? Because the whole point why it wants to do that is so that it can actually have the capacity to not have those constraints. It's kind of like getting a job when you have no experience. Like, how does it go about that?
It's a catch-22 also scenario. So this is a very good question. So the short answer is that there are two approaches to this. One is sort of on your own, what you can do as a country versus what you can do as a block of countries, which is something that I've been talking about quite a bit lately. So I'll start with, one country, maybe with one leader that is motivated to restore economic and monetary sovereignty. Think about it this way. We start with the structural deficiencies, so for example, food, just the food part. You don't have to fix everything at once. Think about, most developing countries now that are locked into a system of cash crop exports, where you export coffee and tea and tobacco. So you dedicate the most fertile land, the most precious water resources, and logistical capacity to exporting cash crops. But then you import the food that you actually need for your people's food security, actual food security, like the wheat, the corn, the rice, the barley, and so on. Think about it this way. Every metric ton of food you produce locally saves you the equivalent of dollars you had to borrow and interest you had to pay for several years, sometimes several decades. And 1 metric ton is nothing, right? So every country on this planet is able, with the strategic planning and political commitment and leadership, to dedicate in 1 year, agriculture is just a 12-month cycle, right? In 1 year, a little bit of additional capacity, that is labor capacity that doesn't need to be funded by dollars, and land capacity, water capacity, technical assistance capacity, all of which is domestic, right? You don't need dollars or a loan from the World Bank to do this, to increase your domestic productive capacity. And you do that over a certain time period. And now all of a sudden, you freed up a little bit of your fiscal policy space to do things differently. So just focusing on the agriculture part, you actually reduce your food deficit, which means you reduce the inflation pressure point that was coming through imports. Now you have additional dollar, reserves that you can use maybe to address the second structural deficiency. So now every green kilowatt hour of electricity you produce locally with those additional dollars that you've saved, right? That you used to dedicate to food imports, to import solar panels or renewable energy capacity. Every green kilowatt hour saves you the equivalent of dollars you had to borrow to import fuel for your economy and pay interest on those dollars, sometimes in perpetuity because of the structural trap that we described. So now all of a sudden, one country with like small steps, all of a sudden can address the root causes of inflation, the root causes of trade deficits, the root causes of a weaker currency, and building more resilience, reducing its carbon footprint. Coincidentally, all of this stuff that we're describing from a debt and development perspective, all of this happens to be also climate action. So it's a win-win, right? That's why I always say you can't decarbonize a system without structurally decolonizing it as well, right? So these are small things that countries can do on a small scale and then increase depending on the availability of resources, labor skills. Of course, you have to, have an entire vision for this transformation because you have to train your labor, you have to change your, vocational training programs to meet the needs of your economy. Whereas now our vocational training programs are designed to produce workers that will be employed in those FDI subsidized factories to assemble stuff for some other consumers in the global north. So you have to rewire your priorities to meet the needs of your economy. So these are small things that you can do. Blocks of countries have tremendous advantage to leverage in the global south, in Africa in particular. So now, when you think of a block of countries, let's say 15, 20 countries, you have the complementarity of resources and capabilities, because not all countries have everything they need. You have the youngest labor force on the planet is in the African continent. You have tremendous renewable energy potential in Africa in particular, the largest in the world. Just give you a data point here. According to IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, a couple of years ago produced a report on Africa, and one of the most important takeaways is the following, that Africa by 2040, which is the day after tomorrow on the clock, by 2040 can produce 1,000 times its anticipated energy needs from renewables and completely replace all of the continent's fossil fuel exports. 1,000 times, right? Which we in Africa see as a tremendous opportunity, right? For climate action, for development, all of that. But unfortunately, in the global north, this is perceived as a threat to be eliminated, as a risk to be minimized. Why? Because if you unleash this real potential in Africa, then it's as if you've taken the economic and geopolitical weight of OPEC countries, for example, and multiplied it by 1,000. And that's why it's perceived as a disruptive threat, because it will disrupt the colonial hierarchy that I described earlier. Because if you have that much energy potential and that much industrialization potential, then you're no longer locked at the bottom of the value chain. You're no longer the provider of cheap raw materials and cheap labor for the industrialized world. And that is disruptive, and disruptive in a good way from an African perspective, but not so much from a global north perspective. So now that block of countries with complementarity of resources and capabilities has everything it needs to unleash this full potential, except one thing, which is if you want to manufacture and deploy renewables infrastructure, for example, high-speed rail, clean public transportation infrastructure, all of that manufacturing, creating millions of jobs, real industrialization, high value-added industrialization, you still have a problem, which is you have the economies of scale as a block because you're a large market, which is great. That's what you need for industrialization, but you don't have access to the manufacturing technology, which is available, by the way, in Europe and the US and China, Japan, other places. The question is, who is going to share and transfer that technology and maybe partner with you as a joint venture to actually unleash this full potential? Now, off-the-record conversations and historical record indicates that the global north, the OECD countries, are absolutely not going to share technology, right? These are the rules of international trade. This is off-the-record conversations in recent years, in the last couple of years, saying nobody is allowed to industrialize in the global south without the approval of a hegemon, without the approval of the OECD, basically, or the United States. So we know this for a fact. And that led me in the last year or so to start thinking about what is this geopolitical leverage that we can use to compel OECD countries to actually share their technology, to compel them to undo the colonial hierarchy that we're dealing with. And this is where the power of that global south geopolitical bloc can come in. So imagine that block of countries with all the resources, capabilities, economies of scale, pre-designing, co-designing a joint industrial policy to manufacture and deploy solar, wind, geothermal, high-speed rail, all of that, on terms that are favorable to that bloc, on terms that redefine the terms and conditions of extractivism from the global south, to protect human rights, labor rights, environmental rights, and to even define certain areas as untouchable for ecological biodiversity reasons. This is our homework. We in the global south have to predefine this and co-design and pre-negotiate the distribution of the value chain even within the bloc, so that you don't have the DRC locked at the bottom of the value chain and South Africa at the top of the value chain, reproducing the same hierarchies within the global south. So this is our homework as economists, as analysts, as think tankers, as civil society organizers, and as governments to predefine the way forward for us. And then say, okay, now the missing piece is access to this technology. And we look at who has the technology now, taking advantage of this geopolitical moment that we're facing today. Imagine that bloc going to China and saying, look, we offer you the bargain of the century, what I call the bargain of the century. Here's the deal. If you share your technology, transfer technology as in joint venture, so contribute in kind, we don't need any dollars, right? Because we pay for our labor with domestic currencies. We pay for our natural resources in the bloc with domestic currencies. Our central banks, they know how to balance, trade imbalances and currency imbalances within the bloc, swap lines and other, tools to help us stabilize internally within the bloc. And we don't need to borrow a single dollar from anybody. We just need in-kind contribution, technical assistance to jumpstart and leapfrog into real industrialization. Basically replicating the entire value chain of manufacturing, for example, solar panels for deployment in the global south. Here's what China gets in return for sharing technology and really jumpstarting this real industrial revolution. In return, in 10 to 15 years, China can double its industrial footprint globally. In 10 to 15 years, China can double its geopolitical weight globally and secure its access to these precious minerals that everybody's panicking about. China also has internal problems that we can solve with this geopolitical bargain of the century, which is China has massive surplus of productive capacity that is, slowly creating problems internally, especially because of the trade restrictions imposed by the US and Europe on Chinese EVs and high-tech products. So you're creating a potential for, stagnation, unemployment within the Chinese economy, which is destabilizing socially and politically. And it's something that actually China's adversary would take advantage of. That when you have an unstable internal economic and political system, that's very easy to take advantage of in terms of divide and conquer, and in terms of actually security destabilization. So we solved that problem because the global south as a whole, right, not just the initial block of countries, we're the global majority. 80% of the world is the global south. So we're potentially the largest market on the planet, bigger than the US and Europe combined. Except we have a problem. We don't have the purchasing power of the US and Europe yet. But if we truly develop and industrialize, then we have the biggest market on the planet. And China, with this bargain, would have sort of priority access to that market, let's say. So I guarantee you China will accept the bargain. China will share technology and trigger a real industrial revolution. But of course, you have to understand that China will not do this for us. We have to prepare the bargain of the century, prepare our homework, prepare our joint industrial policies on our terms. Because you don't do geopolitical bargains. It's like walking into the lion's den. You get eaten alive if you're not prepared for it. And the purpose of this bargain is not really to place China at the top of the global hierarchy, as I'll explain in a second. As soon as we trigger this bargain, we don't actually have to finish it. Now we have the leverage to go to the US, go to France, go to Germany, go to Japan and say, look, we offer you the same deal. If you share technology on our terms to manufacture and deploy geothermal technology, wind turbine technology, high-speed rail technology, clean cooking infrastructure, all the building blocks that we need in the global south for actual development, we want you to participate and share your technology on these terms. At that point, they can't say no, because if they refuse to share wind turbine technology, China has wind turbine, China has high-speed rail, China has the pharmaceutical technology that we want to reproduce. So if they don't participate on these new terms, they lose access to the biggest market. They lose more to China increasing its industrial and geopolitical weight globally. And that's why the purpose of this bargain of the century is not to place China at the top of the hierarchy or any other economic bloc, but rather to reposition Africa and the rest of the global south at the center of a new international economic order of peace, prosperity, and justice, to disrupt the colonial hierarchy of the past and to create a truly multipolar system. And that's why I always say no multipolar system can be born without Africa and the rest of the global south being repositioned at the center of this new international economic order.
One of the questions I was going to ask is, in tangible terms, what does technology transfer mean? Like for, everyday people listening. And you mentioned a few right just there, right? Pharmaceuticals, clean energy. This is all stuff that deals with high skilled labor and essentially stuff that's very difficult to get started. And like, if I recall, like it's always been a problem for developing countries. Like I think the Soviet Union had to like starve its own population to extract grain to basically sell it to get technology from Europe and to like industrialize super rapidly. And then you had China, which embraced capitalism essentially, like foreign direct investment as a way to also be able to get access to technology to industrialize a little bit faster too.
Sure.
So what would be so
Yep.
the trade like okay, so like the trade what does the trade-off look like for Africa and China? Because I think that's the question people are very interested in is Africa's relationship with China. I thought I was under the impression that there already kind of was in like a forming relationship between Africa and China when it comes to trade. Seems from based on what you're saying, like with regard to technology transfers, this has a ways to go. What does that trade-off look like in terms of what China is bringing to the table and what Africa is giving to China? Because would it not also be labor, like cheap labor? Like would China use Africa of cheap labor?
Yeah, so I mean, China's engagement in Africa and the rest of the global south in the last couple of decades is not the kind of transformation that I'm describing here with the bargain of the century. Because, to be honest, the only thing China had to do to gain access to African markets and is just do things at least slightly better and less abusive, less extractive than what the West has done, right? And you've heard this from quite a few African presidents and saying, when the West is complaining about China's access to resources, and it's like, what have you done for us lately, right? So that is unfortunately the reality. It doesn't mean that, we should continue to engage with China on Chinese terms. And that's why this bargain of the century starts with us doing our homework on terms that are favorable to us and then engaging as a bloc. Because if you take a small economy like Malawi, for example, GDP of $20 billion, to negotiate a mining contract, a mining deal with an economy of $20 trillion like China, what do you think you can get out of it? Not much, right? You don't have much of a leverage. But as a block of countries, and a block of countries with the vision, with the strategy that actually offers China something that they want, you can get more out of that. And you can say, these are the terms of extractivism moving forward. These are the terms of engagement moving forward. That is the only true opportunity for structural decolonization. And it's taking advantage of this current geopolitical moment of competition between Europe, the United States, and China. And everybody's talking about repositioning themselves in a new multipolar world, but they all plan on keeping Africa and the rest of the global south at the bottom of that new multilateral system that they want to define for themselves. And I always say, if you don't have a long-term strategic vision for yourself, I guarantee you're already part of somebody else's vision, whether it's Europe and the US or China. And every economic bloc has every right to have a vision for itself and has every right to use its economic diplomacy and incentives and geopolitical weight to nudge everybody to where they want to see them in that vision. But so do we, right? So if we don't organize to reposition ourselves, then we can't complain that other major economic blocs are doing what's best for them and stepping on us to keep us at the bottom of the hierarchy. So in terms of your question, initial question, which is very important, which is labor skills, like capacity to actually implement this. Again, productive capacity is producible. Labor skills are producible. So part of the geopolitical bargain is not just transferring technology and becoming consumers of technology, but establishing a coherent system of education, vocational training, transfer of skills, so that you start planting the seeds of what would become over time, research and development units, product development units, and true technological sovereignty. But you need the leapfrogging boost from the beginning, because we can't afford at this moment in time to miss the current geopolitical moment. We can't afford not to address the major challenges that we're facing in the global south in terms of energy deficits, in terms of food deficits, in terms of the climate impact that we're dealing with, because all of these are, by the way, climate adaptation policies that we're talking about. So we can't afford to start investing in education and wait for indigenous technologies to emerge so that we can, this illusion of catching up is what I said is an illusion. So we need a leapfrogging strategy, and using the current geopolitical moment allows us to do this. And I'm afraid if we miss the small window of opportunity, it will take another century or more to find maybe another opportunity and to organize for this leapfrog moment. And so that's nobody's saying that this is easy, right? This requires a lot of work, a lot of thinking and organizing and creating a real pact within this bloc. Because as we develop this geopolitical bargain and starting the bargain with China, it's not like the rest of the world will sit by and watch as we dismantle colonial structures. There will be pressure on individual countries to destroy the bloc, to leave the bloc. And all of our countries have vulnerabilities and pressure points. You have your food security pressure point, your energy security pressure point, your debt pressure point, your national security pressure point, your regional security pressure point. All of those will be used to destroy this bloc, which means that bloc needs to have a pre-designed pact to secure food supply lines to everybody within the bloc, fuel supply lines, medicine supply lines, and needs to have a security pact, an actual security pact, which may need the involvement of China, which means if you start with the geopolitical bloc in the global south, that includes the major developing countries, maybe South Africa, Brazil, and so on, then all of a sudden you have a portion of BRICS in that bloc, which means you also have Russia. And now all of a sudden you're talking about a security pact that may provide the counterbalance to NATO. And that is, way above my pay grade when it comes to, thinking about, security pacts. But it has to be part of the equation, because it will be naive to assume that all of this decolonization, transformation, and geopolitical disruption will be allowed by NATO, will be allowed by the countries that currently benefit from the existing system.
You use the word "we" a lot, right? If I recall correctly, you're Tunisian?
Yes.
Yeah, you're Tunisian. And so, you're just for the audience, we might not know a little about North Africa,
So
Who's this Arab guy talking about we in Africa? Some people don't know,
Yeah.
especially the Americans. Oh my God.
yeah, and it doesn't help that I have an American accent because I lived here for a long time.
So, who's part of this block of, because you said the word we,
Uh-huh.
who's part of this block or this potential block, if there
Sure.
isn't one yet, regarding Africa? Because you're not talking about BRICS, right? Because people,
No.
when they talk about this new bloc that is against Western hegemony, they think of BRICS, like China, Russia, South Africa, India. But that's not what you're
Yeah.
talking about. What
No,
is the bloc you're
absolutely
talking
not.
about?
Yeah, let me start with BRICS and why BRICS is not it. Because BRICS as a bloc was really not designed to create any of this disruption that I'm describing. BRICS is a sort of mercantilist bloc trying to beat the dominant countries on their own terms in their own game of export-oriented growth, accumulation of trade surpluses and that kind of stuff. But BRICS can be transformed and rewired to do what I just described. But it's not going to be BRICS, China, or certainly not India that will change the vision for BRICS to become like the true structural decolonization, economic bloc. But this bloc that I'm describing for the bargain of the century doesn't exist. It needs to be created. The question becomes which countries will be forming this initial club of nations of the South, for example. And it will certainly not be the African Union, for example, because the African Union is also this collection of countries that are, partly funded by the European Union and other external donors. So it's not the institution for structural transformation, but it can be, but not in the current system. I think this bloc formation needs to start with political leaders. And I'm talking about presidents. It cannot be ministers or other diplomats. It needs to be the highest political authority. So presidents in the global south who actually have the political courage to think differently and act differently. They may not know exactly, they may not have the technical capacity, but you need that minimum level of political commitment that says we need to do things differently. Now, how differently? Let's figure this out. So that eliminates a whole bunch of presidents in the global south and leaves a handful of countries to start with. So that will be countries like Brazil, for example, Colombia today under Petro, Honduras, Cuba, the Sahel countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, maybe Uganda, maybe Namibia, a handful of other countries. But there is no existing bloc that we can say, oh, that's the bloc that's going to transform the world. And it starts with conversations with those key individuals at the highest levels, not with their, ministers of finance or their ministers of energy. It needs to be the highest level political authority, understanding that this bargain of the century is technically feasible, within reach, not easy, but feasible, right? And it's a unique opportunity. So then the conversation becomes, okay, let's bring together presidents from all of these countries that would be leading the initial bargain and say, do we have the internal capacity in our ministries to start actually working on the details, right, of joint industrial policies, on the security pact, on all of this, and doing our own homework and saying, do we have the courage to stick together to move forward with this strategy? And that's where it needs to start. It's not going to start with you and I sort of having this wonderful conversation with, hundreds of other people who are interested in this kind of transformation. Of course, a lot of people told me, why are you saying this publicly? Why not go whisper it in some president's ears and keep it as a secret plan? And my thinking was like, that's how you guarantee all the assassinations. It was just 5 people who know about what is possible. What we want is to educate, empower, mobilize, organize people from below, civil society groups, media, academic thinking, policy think tanking, and policy advisors across the system so that we collectively build, the pathway for this transformation. It's not enough to have presidents only kind of like the idea and say, okay, we're going to do it. It will fail if it's only presidents and ministers who are interested in this. You need to build the mass support and understanding and commitment to this transformation, both in the global north and in the global south, by the way, because a lot of people say, oh, this is just the global south, like taking from the global north, and this will be maybe opposed by civil societies in the north, by labor unions in the north. And I say it's absolutely not, because when our workers in the global south are no longer available to do assembly line manufacturing that is being outsourced from the global north, then workers and labor unions in the global north have better protection. Their social protection is actually enhanced. And then we redirect our attention, both north and south, to what really matters, which is, why are workers losing when it comes to, jobs, when it comes to standard of living, when it comes to the position of the middle class? It's not because immigrants, it's not because workers in the South stealing their jobs. It's because of labor displacing technology, right? And who's taking advantage of the gains from productivity from labor displacing technology? It's not workers, it's the shareholders. So now we refocus the conversation on distribution. We refocus our conversation on the things that really matter to workers in the North and the South. The old phrase, workers of the world unite? This is it. But now we're actually being divided because we're told that, workers in the North are losing because of immigrants, because of workers in the South, and so on. So real industrialization in the global South ought to be supported by workers in the North as well, for the reasons that I just explained. And then when it comes to, the actual use of resources. So when the global South is truly industrializing, using its own critical minerals to manufacture and deploy the technology we need, the infrastructure, renewables infrastructure, that means that the availability of critical minerals globally will be reduced for the global North, which means the obsession with growth, the obsession with consumerism, the obsession with planned obsolescence is no longer viable in the global North, which means you have to start seriously thinking about degrowth in the North, seriously thinking about the creation and sustenance of a circular economy so that we can all live within the planetary boundaries. Because currently, the so-called green growth models of the North, whether it's the European Green Deal or the American IRA or even the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, all of those are growth-obsessed models that assume by definition that the resources will be extracted on traditional terms, colonial terms, from the global South. And what we're talking about here is disrupting that and saying, no more obsession with growth for its own sake. That's, as they say, that's the ideology of a cancer cell, and we can't afford more cancer.
Yeah, as you said, I'm really glad that you really emphasized the fact that workers in the global North would benefit because there's this kind of idea among some third worldist Marxists, those they'll call themselves, who will sometimes think that the interests of the working class in the global North is inherently opposed to the interests of the global South, and that's why they're reactionary. But it's as you mentioned, part of why the labor unions in the global North have so little power, it's not just because they mysteriously have no class consciousness, it's because their power to organize just doesn't exist in the way it did, because capitalists have this freedom to go, take their capital and employ labor for much cheaper and exploit labor elsewhere. And this has led to a huge depreciation in the standard of living, which has only been mitigated and obfuscated by the fact that people get access to all this super cheap consumer bullshit. So it's that's the kind of big thing there that kind of hides the standard of living. That whole aspect, people getting all this kind of false abundance. Some of it's real abundance, some of it's false abundance. But the fact that you can just, I guess, get access to all these cheap goods, it hides that real poverty that does exist.
Right.
And when I hear of degrowth, right, I'm actually in support of the idea that you need to have a less consumerist obsessed economy. I'm very critical of the way that's framed, because I definitely fear a way in which there is a kind of liberal co-optation of the word degrowth that ends up just imposing green austerity on the working class, when really the people who are going to be impacted are upper middle class, upper class people at most, and also just having an economy that's not totally based on producing a million pool floats instead of having actual producing things we need. Now, you seem to want to chime in before I add my next question. I'll let you do.
I mean, all of these ideas can be hijacked and co-opted and rebranded in the most vicious way. And on your point about the working class, the middle class in Europe, and how the current system is fueling consumerism, on the backs of people in the global South. The most dangerous thing that I see developing in the next 10 years or so globally is the weaponization of climate finance to reproduce the colonial hierarchies on terms that I can describe. So think of all of these things that they call green industrialization in Africa, right? What they're talking about is really not manufacturing and deploying green infrastructure and technology for Africans. It's about investing in green electricity or green hydrogen production units, either to export electricity directly to Europe or export green hydrogen to Europe, or to set up actual manufacturing zones like the Green Industrial Zone in Namibia. But the question is, what is being done there? So two things. Number one, outsourcing all the obsolete assembly line manufacturing from Europe to be assembled in the green industrial zone in Namibia, using, water, land, solar, resources and labor resources in Namibia, not to manufacture anything for the Namibian economy, but to assemble products that are now labeled green to be consumed in the European Union, for example. But then you have the CBAM regulation that the EU introduced. CBAM is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, just sort of a border tax. The idea here is that if a product is green, it enters the EU without paying the CBAM tax. If it's not green, it has to pay a tax. So it turns out that the combination of the green industrial zone in Namibia and CBAM serves three roles. Number one, it's locking Namibia at the bottom of the value chain, extracting its resources, labor resources, energy resources, so on, reproducing the colonial role for Namibia. Number two, it's serving as an inflation management tool for the European Union to keep the cost of living. And number three, it serves as a trade weapon against Europe's competitors who don't have green industrial zones yet, right? Think of, for example, the manufacturing of green steel in Mauritania for the European Union. Huge renewables infrastructure to produce very energy intensive green steel for European industries. And that is now blocking the imports of non-green steel from Korea, from Brazil, from Japan, from other places. So it's a trade weapon. And this is all labeled climate finance and climate action, but it's weaponizing climate finance, weaponizing climate action to reproduce the exact same colonial hierarchy that we've seen. And it's not just Europe, by the way. The UK is about to introduce its CBAM. So soon you'll hear about the British green industrial zones in the south. The US, Canada, Japan, Australia, all of them are trying to introduce CBAM-like regulations that will be matched by climate action in the south, climate finance, to lock the global south back in the same colonial role that we described earlier. And that is one of the most dangerous kind of hijacking of climate action to reproduce colonial systems. And that's why I always say you cannot decarbonize a system that hasn't been structurally and economically decolonized yet.
And that's what I think is truly insidious, is sometimes there will be upper middle class PhD or university activists who will say decolonization, but then they'll push degrowth initiatives without clear distinction to the people who need to be doing the degrowing and how.
Yep.
And that is something, like you said, this green imperialism that could emerge, I think is very dangerous. I see it with the kind of embrace of anti-natalist rhetoric, which is kind of like, we need to make sure people have less children for the planet. And I see, people like Bill Gates talking about how, Africa has too many people. I mean, we won't say it in such an openly insidious way, but it'll basically say, population growth might be troubling for the climate. And it's like, what does this mean? And yeah, I do fear, like, just by nature of the fact that, like, sometimes we have this problem, right, where a lot of the left, even what passes for the left, is like upper middle class activists will actually in their heart of hearts believe that they are doing like climate initiatives, but they'll end up kind of pushing an initiative that will actually be bad for working people. And I'm curious, like, how that gets avoided, because sometimes about the word co-optation, I'm kind of, part of me doesn't fully believe in co-optation, in the sense that I think if it were something got co-opted, it means you were using the wrong language, or you weren't framing it correctly in the first place. In the sense that I think, I don't know about, like, the degrowth, I think has to be class centered. Just because based on what, like, I mean, the whole way you framed all this, right, is like the working class of the global north and the global south having common interests, in that the global north wants to increase their labor power, which is diminished by this current trade regime, and the global south is dependent on this colonial economy, essentially, or I guess more accurately, maybe we could say imperialism, in the sense, like, Lenin even described in Imperialism, Highest Stage of Capitalism, this trade dependencies. But
Sure.
yeah, how would, well, I don't know if you have anything to add to that before I move on to the next thing about food sovereignty.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, this, the old phrase from from Nazi Germany, give me ignorance and fear, and I can rule the world. This is what we see being weaponized in terms of the middle class, the working class, and the global North being ignorant of the facts that their real adversary, the adversary of their better quality of life, is not immigrants, it's not people in the global South. It's the multinational corporations that take advantage of the system. It's the imperialist global system that is, putting people against each other, working class from the North and from the South, to control the system, to manipulate the system. And it's people in the South also who are being told, it's the, consumer in the global North that, provides your jobs, right? So you should be grateful for the fact that they're richer, because if they're not consuming, then you'll be out of a job, right? So it's these narratives that must be destroyed. And I think you can't kill these ideas, these perverse ideas, without educating, organizing, mobilizing people to engage in a public discourse that is critical, right? Because this is where the power of ideas matters. It's not going to be some sort of decree or some sort of international agreement that will fix any of this. This will have to be a public discourse that is critical, that is rich, that is diverse, that is open and honest to undo this. Otherwise, we're constantly being fooled about all kinds of things. I mean, you go to, COP29 this year, the climate negotiations, was supposed to be the climate finance COP, right? And at the end of the thing, I looked at it and I was like, this thing was not about climate finance. It wasn't even about climate, actually. It was about a geopolitical and economic colonial hierarchy that is not meant to be disrupted. Because what the Global South was asking for at COP29 in terms of climate finance was transformative finance, finance that will actually undo the structural problems that we described today, and finance that will actually simultaneously address the climate needs, but also the real development needs of the Global South. And that's why that was a red line, right? That is unacceptable by the Global North. And you use all kinds of excuses to, provide you with false solutions and distractions and tranquilizing drugs to avoid the real transformation. So at the end of the day, everybody knows, especially in the Global North, I'm talking about, political leaders and geopolitical strategists who advise them that, real climate action will be dangerous actually for the colonial hierarchy, the existing power structure. And that's why it's not even an option for them. And so the question becomes for us, how do we create a leverage to compel those powerful blocs in the Global North to act differently, to interact differently, to actually be willing to share life-saving technologies? We're not talking about share all of your technology. Life-saving technology to address real, human needs today.
You mentioned it, not being the immigrants, right? One thing that I've noticed is totally missing in the way the far right, and frankly, the way what passes for the left responds to the far right when it comes to immigration, and also the related issue of climate refugees, which is only going to get worse as climate change gets worse. Well, is that migration from the Global South to the North is a form of imperialism in itself. There's a book called Migration is Economic Imperialism. I really opened my eye to this. I mean, it's not good for the Global South to have people constantly leaving. I mean, it's just bad at the level of brain drain, at the level of productive capacity, and so much. If anyone wants progressive politics, you shouldn't want this. So I think, the far right, will say, oh, immigration, but if it was serious of actually wanting to reduce immigration, even if it has might have perverse reasons for its reason for doing so, I mean, you'd want these countries to actually do well. You would want people to want to live in the countries they're at. People don't just leave their homes because it's a very difficult thing to do. People would rather stay where they grow up, and especially if it's a nice place to live, it's better for everybody, really. But like they don't want to deal with those root causes. They just want to build like huge borders. Now, I think sometimes the far left makes a mistake of saying, okay, well, let's take the opposite approach of what the right does and say open borders. And I'm thinking like, whoa. Like, wait, so you just want to like have all the people from the global south just like, that's not good for their countries either. That's kind of like a capitalist Milton Friedman idea, like this kind of idea of just open migration, which, and you have a kind of also migration that's stripped of labor rights that can be exploited very easily. It just seems a capitalist dystopia, to be honest. When it comes to this, like, how does one articulate a policy in a way that actually can like maybe demystify this sort of discourse? Because like, yeah, I see some people progressive on the left, they won't want to deal with that. They'll say, okay, let's just open borders. And the right will say, oh, no, just build the wall. But it's like, wouldn't the most progressive policy to be like, essentially like the root of the problem, like with the globalist, like I heard the Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, was saying, I mean, well, we care about immigration too. Like, we don't want people in our country like mass leaving to the United States. We want, we care about this just as much as you guys do. So I know, maybe what do you have to say to maybe help like us make sense of this? Because frankly, I can't stand the way this is debated. Like even in the German elections, you have the far right talking about huge border walls and the left party De Link talking about open borders. And I feel like both of them are wrong. The far right's more wrong, but the left's position's inadequate in my view.
Yeah. There's actually a great book by a Swedish political scientist published a few years ago called MMT, Modern Migration Theory, actually linking MMT, the MMT we're talking about, modern monetary theory, to migration theory in Europe in particular, and Sweden is a Swedish scholar that is worth looking at. It's a great book. But also, the World Bank of all places has produced a report now a couple of times called Groundswell on climate-induced mass movement of people. And what they're forecasting is a very conservative forecast, is that by 2050, there'll be more than 220 some million people displaced, mostly in the global south, more than 100 in Africa alone. And when you have mass movement of people at that scale, and that's a very conservative estimate, by the way, and they do have the 2030 forecast, which is, people are already on the move, as we know, and the numbers are outrageous. When we have mass movement of people at that scale and magnitude, you're putting additional pressure on resources, for housing, for education, for health, for jobs, and you're exacerbating pressure points, potential conflict, and we know what happens. I mean, the Syrian migration crisis of a few years ago, a decade ago now, in Europe, people panicked, right? And it's just one country, Syrians, because of the conflict that was happening at the time, and Europe closed its borders, everybody panicked. Imagine hundreds of millions of people potentially displaced globally, mostly moving to the global north. Is anybody fiscally, logistically prepared to welcome and treat people with dignity from a logistical infrastructure standpoint? We're not, which means, again, climate action in the South is important, not in the forms of building, a security system that will prevent people from crossing borders, which is unfortunately what most countries are now doing. Are saying to stop the migrants, we'll just give their governments better equipment and radars and satellite imaging and weapons and speedboats to police the Mediterranean. And that is the disaster that we're seeing now. To their credit, the Italian government last year introduced what they called the Mattei Plan for Africa, which is another colonial vision that the Italians and the G7 have introduced. But to their credit, they recognized that there's some serious migration problem, because the gateway to Europe, one of the gateways, is the small, tiny island of Lampedusa, the Italian island in the Mediterranean, which is over flooded by migrants coming from Tunisia and Libya, but coming from the entire world, mostly from Africa. So they said, to stop this problem at its source, we need to invest in home countries to create jobs so that we minimize the so-called push factor. There's push factors for migration, there's pull factors. So you have to give them credit that they're thinking, okay, we need to invest at the source so that people have livelihood, so that they can actually, have at least the option to say, look, I have decent livelihood, I stay at home. The problem is that the list of investments are purely extractive investments that are labeled green. And the problem is that the entire Matai plan for Africa, an entire continent, is something like $5 billion, which is nothing, right? So this is the problem that we're facing today, is that we have
That's
no
it?
political. That's it, $5 billion, maybe six.
Those are
Most
like-
of it is
that's
loans, by the way,
Canadian government.
and mostly from the private sector.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's
So
cool.
that's how ambitious our action is about these things. So that is a serious problem, and it's a problem not just in the north; it's also a problem in the south. I'll give you my own country, Tunisia. In one of the recent presidential elections, maybe 2018, 2019, televised debate, all the candidates on the stage, and one of the candidates brought up the issue of brain drain from Tunisia to Europe, which is a huge problem, because brain drain is with migration restrictions now, is highly selective brain drain. So we're talking about engineers, doctors, computer scientists only who are allowed in this brain drain migration system. So I thought, well, this is fantastic. All the candidates now are going to weigh in on the problem of brain drain from Tunisia, from the global south. And these are, intelligent political, leaders who are, some of them are pretty decent in terms of their thinking. But just to show you how weak the thinking is in terms of brain drain, this candidate said, we need to be tough when we negotiate with the Europeans. They're taking our doctors, our engineers, our scientists. We need to tell them, for every Tunisian engineer you take, for every Tunisian doctor you take, you need to take 5 unskilled workers with them. And everybody on the stage, yes, we need to do that. It's like, really? This is how, these are progressive candidates who are thinking about. So we have because we've been completely, we as in political leaders, policymakers in the global south, we're completely fooled into this entire way of thinking about our economy, that our role and our best options and opportunities is to, be the barnacles attached to the ship of the European economies or the global north economies, and to serve their interest, which means we want them to bring foreign direct investment to us. That's a great success. We want them to lend us money on reasonable terms. That's a sign of great success, believe it or not. We want them to import our raw materials, our olive oils, our tomatoes. We celebrate when they import those things, when we serve as the providers of these low value added, products. We want them to, sell to us their fancy cars. We see that as a great bonding and building of relationships and partnership. There's very little critical thinking in terms of what it's actually doing to the country, what it's doing to the continent. And that means we have some serious work to do in terms of decolonizing the mind. These are intellectuals. These are educated policymakers who are not thinking critically about what is happening. So it's not decolonizing economic structures. That's like high level, technical stuff that we're talking about here. We're talking about decolonizing the mind, decolonizing education system, decolonizing the public discourse that is deeply colonial. And that is on us. That is in the South, right? This is not the Italians or the French or the G7 coming and imposing a colonial role today. We're already fully immersed into their vision of our role in the global system. And that needs to change.
You mentioned the Italian government. One thing I will give credit to Meloni for, right, is she's so anti-immigration that she's actually committed to solving the problem in a way that the other anti-immigration leaders on the far right in Europe just aren't. Like, meanwhile, you have Marie Le Pen, who talks about immigration being a problem, yet she has no issue with French colonialism and is even proud of it. She didn't even pretend to think like the other progressives will denounce the legacy and continue with the same stuff. But she didn't even think it's a problem, and she'll support Israel and not see how that has consequences of refugees with all the suffering it's causing, not just in Palestine, but in Syria too. And Maloney at least is in the, that proposal is clearly not enough, but at least in the right direction in that, okay, well, if you want to get to the bottom of this, if you're serious, you don't just want to shoot people at the border. If you actually want to get to the bottom of this, well, you need to actually help these countries. And I mean, it does seem implausible that you would have from the North, helping the global South. And I think you're perfectly correct to say, it's up to the global South to really build its own independence. But I don't think it's impossible to see a sort of Marshall Plan of sorts. That's America has helped other countries when it's conveniently benefited, its anti-Soviet interests, right? But it was willing to back countries to see it solve its geopolitical issues. And they can certainly do that. They could. There's plenty of technology transfers, but obviously the plenty of capitalists have a vested interest in not wanting to do that. But I think there's plenty there for the North to kind of help the South.
I'm glad you mentioned the Marshall Plan, because people pretend like we don't know actually how to do real development and transformation in the global South. But when you go back to before the Marshall Plan, actually at the end of World War II, the plan that the U.S. had for Germany, and that was actually what was implemented the first 3 or 4 years, is for Germany to become a backwards nation, never to rise again, an agrarian society. And that was actually what was introduced for the first few years after the war, until Marshall showed up with the Marshall Plan and said, this is stupid, basically. We need Germany to be an industrial and economic powerhouse to withstand the Soviet threat. And that's where the Marshall Plan started. And it wasn't just the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, you have to remember that the U.S. gifted 5% of its GDP. That's the equivalent of $1.3 trillion today, which coincidentally, by the way, the number that the Global South asked for in terms of climate finance was coincidentally $1.3 trillion this year at COP. So the U.S. gifted 5% of its GDP, transferred technology for an actual industrialization plan for Germany. In addition to that, the U.S. and the rest of the world at the time, led by the UK and the US and so on, canceled 50% of Germany's debt. No country in the global South today gets a 50% debt cancellation, not even close, right? So the formula is cancel 50% of the debt, at least, transfer technology, and support with grants and transfer of technology for real industrialization and structural transformation and rebuilding of the infrastructure of development and prosperity. We know how to do it, right? We've done it before. But this transfer of technology is done for geopolitical reasons. So there are countries that manage to industrialize up to a certain point because they were allowed to. So think of Germany after the war, Japan after the war, Singapore, Israel, South Korea. All of these are handpicked geostrategically to industrialize up to a certain point. When Japan industrialized too much and became the second largest economy and became a threat to the US economy, it had to be stopped, and it was stopped, right? With actual pressure from the US. So we have to understand that we know how to do development. And so what is being served to the global South today is a big menu of tranquilizing drugs that are not supposed to provide that transformation. And debt cancellation, forget about it. Transfer of technology, a red line. So this is the reality. We know how to do real development and prosperity, but there is no geopolitical interest in the dominant blocs to actually do it. And that's why most of my work now is focused on, okay, we know the technical stuff that needs to be done. Technology is available. This is technically feasible. The question is, how do we create the geopolitical leverage to change the hierarchy, to allow that transformation actually to take place.
I mean, talking about geopolitical interests, there at one point was the Soviet Union. Soviet Union did have a pretty, people forget how big the influence it did have in Africa. Some say it wasn't particularly a great influence, but I mean, I will kind of, that's something I had as an extra question. I didn't send it to you because I was like, where are we going to get to this? But it just kind of occurred now. I mean, like, what do you think of that whole kind of legacy of quote unquote socialism in Africa that was brought kind of by the Soviet Union indirectly by kind of backing certain groups, giving arms to certain groups who are fighting colonizers, let me add. But, they have built like these state economies. What I do wonder is like, okay, if we're going to expect like countries to maybe help other countries, where I'm very cynical about that is like, even when there was a so-called like socialist power, the Soviet Union committed to international socialism, it never really even seemed to actually like back other countries unless it had a very strong interest to do so, like Cuba, for example, in response to the NATO base in Turkey.
Sure.
Right. So I just kind of,
Well, this is an important lesson for us to remember as we think about the current geopolitical, competition and conflicts, is that the major dominant blocks in terms of economic weight and geopolitical weight and military weight, they will do what's best for them, which means yes, they will support countries that are trying to decolonize in Africa. Because it serves the broader vision that they have for themselves, right? The US supporting in Tunisia in the 1960s supported socialist type economic plans, were funded by the JFK administration up to a certain point. But then when it became clear that they might actually go into like a real socialist system, then it was, that's the red line. So it's even the U.S. supported, some progressive, socialist light transformation because the U.S. didn't want the Soviets to come in and do their part and have influence and access and so on. The DRC, the Congo, which is bleeding to this day, right? The geopolitical tension for the resources of the DRC during the Cold War, millions of people killed for decades. That is, whose interest is it serving? It's the competition of the major powers trying to reproduce the colonial model that we described today, to extract from the DRC, not to allow the DRC to have its own sovereignty and independence and potential to be the richest, one of the most powerful nations on the planet. That is not allowed, right? So these are lessons for us from history to understand that nobody's going to come to fix the system for you on your own terms, for your own benefits. They will do it for themselves. They may be helpful, but you have to develop your own vision and create your own leverage in order to get things done on your own terms. That is really the message that I get from history, from what we're seeing. And that's why this, the geopolitical transformation, the decolonization is not going to happen because of BRICS. It's not going to happen because of G7. It's not even going to happen because of China or Russia or any other country. It can only be born and it can only happen with the formation of global South leadership on its own terms, and then using the existing geopolitical competitive space to give and take, and to try to to reposition itself in a more favorable in the global economy. And it's not going to be easy, but it's not going to be done by anybody else.
I'm with you there in that, you have to, like, countries are going to have to build independence. Now, I think there's this interesting thing where a lot of the leftist proclivity towards internationalism can sometimes turn into a naive belief in other superpowers, like, which is not really internationalism, but this belief that like this other international order led by some power is going to save us, like China or whatever. And one criticism I hear sometimes from Marxist adjacent types, and the liberals, interestingly, of MMT is that MMT has an, so they say, inherently nationalist bent. In that if you take the idea that every country needs to build its food sovereignty, its economic independence, you could lead potentially to a, for lack of a better term, Stalinization effect, in that like the country turns inward and kind of depends on itself. And so that's maybe the left critique. The liberal, maybe Fukuyamaist critique would be, well, wouldn't it be inefficient for countries to produce things themselves because other countries can produce it cheaper? And if everything will just be way more expensive if people produce things domestically instead of have this international trade. What do you have to say to kind of both those critiques? The left critique of, the more nationalism, and the liberal, more economic critique.
Well, the liberal critique, I mean, remember COVID? Remember supply chain disruptions? So that's one reason. The other thing is, I'm an MMT economist, and I think from this conversation, you can, clearly get the message that I'm not advocating and saying that every country will produce everything domestically. It's, food, energy, technology. It's not really what we're advocating, but we're advocating for at least regional, resilience, let's call it. And that means regional food sovereignty, where, you have the complementarity of resources and capabilities. So you're more resilient to global disruptions, whether it's shipping, whether it's climate, so it's not a nationalist vision, although there is nothing wrong with a nationalist vision, but we're actually talking about joint venture type of partnerships, especially when it comes to industrial policy. Nobody in the global south is going to truly industrialize on a national plan. Because if you do that and you're a small economy like the Tunisian economy or any other economy in the global south, with the exception of maybe China or India, because they have the economies of scale. When you don't have the economies of scale for industrialization, you end up manufacturing a small component in somebody else's industrial policy. And that's essentially our role today, is to do the assembly line, manufacturing for other, or manufacturing small components in somebody else's industrial policy. So MMT is definitely not advocating, national industrial policies of the type that lock us into this. And when it comes to the critique that
you're not saying we should become like North Korea.
Well, what has North Korea done? I mean, is it a sustainable prosperity model that we should follow? I mean, it's a model of resistance of some sort. It's a model that shows what, when you have political commitment to dedicating resources to certain things, you can get it done, but at what cost? And of course, it's also an isolated, sanctioned economy. So it's not a model for us to study or to follow.
Oh, I think everyone agrees with that.
There are certain
fear that, like, not necessarily at that totalitarian scale, but like that, having like even food sovereignty alone, for example, like the kind of neoclassical economists will say, well, that you'll just like make everything more expensive. That's kind of their idea. Now you made that. I think your point about the supply chain disruptions and the COVID. I mean, that just shows how like that can be like this system that exists can be inflationary and unstable. But
sure,
I guess they would say like, yeah, if you build this self-reliance on food, for example, while it can make the country stronger, it could also lead to higher prices for all those goods. And also, I don't know, is it even?
Looking at higher prices of food in isolation, looking at higher prices of food in isolation is a mistake also, because you do want decent prices for agricultural products so that you support your farmers. You don't want your farmers to go bankrupt, and because that's what the existing model does. You bankrupt your farmers so that you import from big agribusiness in the global north. But you can't just set higher prices for food without having an entire coherent economic system that provides decent wages for workers, right? So that, you have an entire system, economic system that actually supports higher agricultural prices without bankrupting farmers, without starving families. But we live in a system in the global south where food prices have to be low so that workers,
Right.
assembly line manufacturing workers, can actually survive on low wages. So we do this on the backs of people, right? But if you have high value added manufacturing, high paying jobs, it allows workers, working class, to actually afford domestic food prices and support farmers in their country and in their region. So it's an entire set of policies. We're not going to change this just with agricultural policy. You need to have agriculture, energy, transportation, industry. All of these are part of an entire transformation that needs to happen. It can't be just removing food subsidies and expecting everything to work, or just subsidizing farmers and not changing anything else. It's an entire ecosystem that needs to be transformed.
And this would, of course, the person paying the price for this would be the capitalist, because it would come from their profits, not from the workers, because like that higher price would be compensated by the higher wage. Now, that
That's what we said earlier. Refocus
Right.
the conversation on distribution,
Precisely.
on pre-distribution, not redistribution. This is also a fundamental contribution of MMT.
Pre-distribution.
Because redistribution assumes that you accept the injustice of the system, right? That is actually distributing in the wrong way, in the wrong direction, and then trying to struggle in a political system that is not controlled by you, the middle class or the working class. It's controlled by the elite, trying to struggle in that system to say, please, could you please redistribute a little bit so we can eat, so we can have a little bit of green investment, so we can have education. And that is a losing battle, right? Especially in the current system. So we want to be fighting for a pre-distribution model where income is actually distributed the right way from the beginning. So we want to change the engine of the economy, the engine that produces injustice, inequality, pollution, socioeconomic exclusion, and put an engine in place that produces the correct results, that produces justice by design, produces, sustainable prosperity by design. But, a lot of the left rhetoric and progressive rhetoric is focused on redistribution. Let's tax the oligarch. Let's tax the polluters so we can have a little bit of the good stuff. And if you accept that vision, then you're basically saying your logic is that we want the, oligarchs to be even richer so we can tax a little bit of their wealth to distribute for the rest of us. We want, pollution, fossil fuel companies to be bigger, more powerful, more profitable so we can tax a little bit of their profits to invest in green stuff, which means you want them to be bigger and more powerful. You're not getting anything from them, right? So we need to tax them and regulate them out of existence to change the engines of the economy, to start pre-distributing and producing sustainable outcomes that we want instead of struggling to beg for redistribution.
Right. And that wouldn't also involve, a change in power relations, of course, but potentially ownership. That's kind of where the whole ownership question, I think, is very interesting. Because if it's not just taxing, why not have part of the companies owned actually by the people who are doing the work, right? The employees. It's kind of an idea I thought was interesting. Now, one final question I'll ask, because we're running up on time, but it is directly related to this. And this is one of the more, I think, semi-valid critiques of MMT that I've heard from Marxists, which is that, okay, all this, right, presumes workers having a certain level of power, and it presumes class struggle to even have this done in this progressive way. Now, if workers have power, have unions, they have the power to set higher wages. Now, unless the power of the price setter is taken away from the capitalist, which is a huge change, and how do you do that? It's a big question. Wouldn't that just lead to higher prices? And unless they want to kind of subordinate the capitalist and give power fully to the worker, if you have this trade unionist situation, you have potentially a risk of wage price spiral, right? And to contain that would mean to contain the unions, which was what the corporatist response to that problem that was seen in social democracies which is basically subordinate the labor unions to the state. And this is what I've heard some Marxists fear with MMT, that like, if this could be a driver of inflation, wouldn't it just mean subordinating the workers to the state to prevent these things from causing inflation? And I kind of want you to respond to that.
It's kind of interesting that this comes from Marxists of all people, because limiting the control of inflation to workers or to unions is really, I have to say, is ridiculous if you really understand what price setting behavior is. And going back to what we discussed earlier about the risk of inflation and price setting behavior, and what we discussed there is that you tax and regulate abusive price setting behavior out of existence, and you upgrade or introduce, antitrust regulation to manage the risk of inflation instead of targeting unions. If anything, you want to strengthen the position of unions and reduce the monopoly power of corporations and multinational entities. But who's going to do this regulation? Who are the regulators? The regulators are your 535, politicians in Washington, D.C., for example, who are supposed to be the government of the people, by the people, all right, for the people. But will they bite the hands that feed them? Because we have a political system, supposedly a democracy, that is, funded when it comes to campaign finance by super PACs, by corporate entities, by the oligarchs. And we see it right now. The oligarch is sitting in the White House, right? So this is a question fundamentally of democracies. It's not about labor unions spiraling prices and inflation out of control. It's about the oligarchs sitting in the halls of power, right? Today, sitting literally in control of the halls of power, not just on the outside influencing with a little bit of, campaign finance contribution. So this is fundamentally how you democratize your price system, democratize your economic system. And it's fundamentally a political question. And it's, disturbing that, intellectuals who should be understanding this stuff would blame workers for spiraling inflation and would, criticize MMT for not understanding how inflation spirals, take place and where to stop them. It's about power, right? It's not just about union power. It's about the real, corporate power,
right,
of the oligarchs that weaponizes the price system against the working class, against everybody. And then you take it to a global scale and it's imperial power.
I should clarify, for the Marxists don't so much make the argument about the wage price spiral. That is more so like the neoclassicals and neoliberals economists, right? Friedman, of course, most famously, Milton Friedman.
Sure. Yeah.
But like the Marxists seem to not like the MMT solutions, because you mentioned that like what is actually reducing the price setting behavior of capitalists look like? Antitrust legislation, preventing their power essentially over the economy, setting prices. Now, some of the very like orthodox Marxist types, they hear that and they think, well, so you want more capitalist competition, you want more free market, and they prefer, for example, like a state command economy. Now we know, like anyone who's intellectually honest knows that the command economies of the past didn't work so well. But what they say is that it could work now because of data and the ability to now fix what's of course called the
calculation problem.
Yeah, the economic calculation problem. That's right. Yeah. So they kind of say, well, actually, we can just plan the economy. That would solve the problem. And they're critical of the idea of antitrust, because isn't there the falling rate of profit, which would compel the companies to grow? So is the government's job just to continually keep breaking up the companies so that they can't be big enough to set prices? If so, is that not kind of almost an ordo-liberal solution? like when I mean ordo-liberal, not neoliberal, but like the West German economists had kind of idea, which is like, let's keep this capitalist competition, but let's break up the big price setters. And this is Elizabeth Warren's idea, for example, in the United States. I'm kind of curious where you sit in this sort of debate.
So I have no issues with nationalizing certain industries, by the way. I don't fall into a category of any ism, whether it's Marxism or this ism or that ism. I focus on what actually works, what is practical, what is democratic, what is just. And there's a wide spectrum of, strategies and policies and ownership structures and regulatory structures that can produce that outcome. So, but you have to be aware that you need those outcomes. So being obsessed with, one kind of ism or the other, one kind of ownership structure of the other is counterproductive. So I have no problem with nationalizing certain industries if it produces, because there's good nationalization and bad nationalization, right? And nationalization can produce also, very vicious monopolies and corruption and abuse of power. But anything that resembles democratic ownership that is, influenced by the interest of workers, of the middle class, of the working class, whatever ism you attach to it, that's what I would want us to talk about. And the narrow focus on a particular set of economic system, allows us to sort of fall into this trap, ideological trap of not considering any other alternative or mix within the system. And I think it's counterproductive. So I'm not for this ism or that ism. I want to produce, the decolonization global economic model that produces a multilateral system of peace, of justice and prosperity that protects workers' rights, protects human rights, protects biodiversity. And if we know how to design, the actual production units and ownership structure within it that delivers those results, then I'm very happy for anybody to create any label and attach an ism to it, and let's call it that.
Oh, I really like that. I really like that pragmatist, Ben. I'll say that.
Yeah.
But I think that was excellently put. We're up on time now, but thank you for being here. I didn't get to all of the questions, but I actually preferred, I found, I think, stuff I was asking in this one more fitting because it just kind of flowed well, and I really like the way it went. Yeah, no, what can viewers, where should viewers find your work, and what would you want to?
Well, people can follow my work on social media. I post blogs on Substack, and it's free and it's open. It's called Global South Perspectives, based here at Denison University in Ohio, and try to be as active as possible, trying to kind of nudge the conversation and policy discussions in the right direction. So thank you again for this opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. And I hope the audience got a lot of value out of this. I certainly did. If you enjoy the show, be sure to give a 5-star rating as usual. And if you want to get tons of exclusive content, I have over 55 exclusive episodes up on Patreon. The Backroom podcast, you get access to all of them just for less than the price of a Starbucks latte. So instead of wasting your money on overpriced coffee from multinational corporations you should boycott, you can, spend just $5 a month and get access to all of that exclusive content if you get value from this show. So without further ado, see you in the next episode.
My only hope is that when enough people become pessimist, then out of despair somebody maybe does something. But you know why I also like to be a pessimist? Because it's the only way to have a nice life. If you're an optimist, then always bad things happen and you are always disappointed. When you are a pessimist, then you look around, okay, there are bad, but from time to time something nice happens and you are, as a pessimist, you are a little bit glad all the time, no?
You are listening to One Dime Radio. Become a patron at patreon.com/onedime to support the show and get access to extra content.